Ladies and gentlemen, please get seated shortly as the show will be beginning soon. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please take a seat. The show will begin shortly.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please take your seats. Good afternoon. Wow, you guys are really good. It only took one good afternoon. Welcome to the most stunning mountains and meadows of Aspen for our 14th annual Aspen Security Forum. We are so happy to be here with all of you. We are all ready to immerse ourselves in this beautiful place for the next 3 days, to step back a little bit and to think bigger and to exercise our imaginations. But we're meeting here at a pretty dangerous time for foreign policy, when war between great powers seems dangerously real and possible. In fact, great powers are acting badly, and by that I mean really Russia and China. So any misstep in our foreign policy could be catastrophic. I recently reread a wonderful book by Marc Bloch, who was a French resistance fighter, and who talks about how the Maginot Line failed because the German Nazi invading armies just circumvented it. And he blames the French senior leadership and says they had a lack of imagination. They were incapable of thinking in terms of a new war. Well, in the next few days, we want to ensure that our children don't accuse us of a similar failure of imagination. Our mission for this Aspen Security Forum is to look further out, over the horizon, not to the next summit meeting, not to the next big meeting in Washington, not even to the next press cycle. You all in the press know who you are. But at what's coming further down the pike, what danger looms around the corner, what opportunities loom around the corner that we're not looking at carefully enough. We are incredibly lucky this year. We are going to hear from very distinguished senior US government officials, Secretaries Mayorkas and Blinken, Linda Thomas Greenfield, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, and we have a lot of Republican representation as well, Secretaries Mark Esper, Mike Pompeo, and Condi Rice, and many others. So we are making this a truly bipartisan, thoughtful forum. We're also very proud, and our team has all collectively been working hard on this. We want to make the Aspen Security Forum more international. We want the rest of the world to get into the conversation. So we're particularly proud to have with us senior leaders from Kenya. You're about to hear from the Kenyan National Security Advisor, Monica Juma. We're going to hear from former Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, senior leaders from the UK, from Canada, from France, China, NATO, Afghanistan, and many others. An important through line of all these conversations that you'll hear in the next few days is technology. We're really at a hinge point in history where the advance of technologies is moving so much faster than what our governments can digest or regulate in any meaningful way. And so we're also going to hear from CEOs, entrepreneurs, and many others who are reshaping how we connect, how we govern, and how we fight. But this is essential. We're not just looking at the dark side, the downside scenario, avoiding the next Maginot Line. That's not what you do in Aspen. This is a positive, optimistic place. And so we're going to here refocus and reimagine how to create a more positive world. We're going to think through how, not just how Ukraine can get through the next 6 months of the war, but how to imagine a prosperous, democratic Ukraine going forward. How the US and China can de-escalate their conflict and maybe cooperate on certain things, even amidst their competition. How the world can responsibly develop and harness artificial intelligence and other technologies, not to wage war, but towards spectacular improvements in health, education, and well-being. The great American optimist, Walt Whitman, captured the spirit that we're trying to channel here in his homage to the American West, which he called Song of the Open Road. We encouraged all of us to loosen ourselves of our limits and imaginary lines. This is the mission for all of us the next few days, and not just those here on stage. So I ask all of you here, in the sessions, in your breakouts, in your meetings, your meals, to use the backdrop of these magnificent Rocky Mountains to envision and create an optimistic future at the world that we can and will build together. Thank you. So I'd love to thank everyone who's here tonight, the speakers, the journalists, the staffers, all of you who are coming and participating in these important conversations. In particular, the amazing Aspen Institute team, Dan Porterfield, Margot Pritzker, all of the teams that help us from comms, from legal, and everything else they're doing. Our media partners, the NBC and the Financial Times, and most importantly, none of this is amazing, but this entire conference, and another one that we run after it, gets put together by 5 people. So I would like our team to stand, please. Our director, Neve King, our deputy director, Leah Batunis, Deb Cunningham, Emily Lawrence, Chris Herman, Anna Klingensmith. They're working these issues all year long. And we have our Scowcraft Fellows and our interns helping for the summer, and a lot of amazing volunteers here at the Aspen Institute helping us just for this. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn it over to Joe Nye, our wonderful co-chair, who we're very, very blessed and lucky to have, who was actually the original innovator of the Aspen Strategy Group and made this all possible. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Anya. Thanks, Anya, and it's a pleasure for me to add a welcome to all of you. Let me recall, in fact, the early days when the Aspen Institute sponsored the Aspen Strategy Group, which was 40 years ago. And while we're sometimes gloomy about the world today, it's worth remembering that at that time, the American polity was almost as politicized as it is now. And there was deep divisions over national security. And there was, with the election of the Reagan administration, feeling that there was a new Cold War, that we're starting up another Cold War. So it was a period of great tension and great differences over how we should respond to it. What's interesting was the idea that if we got people out of Washington and got them up into the Aspen Mountains, perhaps the coolness of Aspen, both literally and figuratively, would lead to better quality discussions. And I think that's proven to be the case. So as we pursue sometimes heated subjects over the next few days, look up to the mountains from which cometh our strength every once in a while. In any case, we invite you to a fantastic set of panels, but I want to do some thank yous before Anya gave a lot of thank yous already, but it's also an enterprise. The Security Forum is an enterprise which requires and benefits from a large number of donors and helpers. And there are so many that I'm going to have to read them out so I don't forget any. But they include Google, MasterCard, McKinsey, Microsoft, MITRE, PayPal, the Rockefeller Foundation, United Launch Alliance, USA Rare Earth, USIT, and the Walton Family Foundation, and as well as Beacon Global Strategies and Intel. We're also sharing tonight's opening program with a collaboration with the Hearst Lecture Series, which is made possible by Bob and Soledad Hearst. But before I sit down and get on with the main substance of the evening, I just want to say that you will find among you this year's group of rising leaders. And I hope if you see somebody who has that label, whether this year, which is the third year of the Rising Leaders, or some of the alumni who are back from other years, talk to them. This is the next generation, and we're going to need them. So in any case, welcome to you all, and may you continue the tradition of looking to the mountains and having a great conversation at Aspen. And with that, Anya, you'll introduce the first panel.
Thank you, Joe. And without further ado, we're going to get started, and we are very lucky to have with us tonight the man who's really on the front line of the increasing tensions between the U.S.-China security relationship, Admiral John Aquilino. And to interview him, we have none less than Courtney Cube, who's the NBC News national security correspondent, and is going to ask him some very tough questions. So I'll invite both of you up to the stage. Thank you.
No.
I can project without a microphone, believe me. There are people in here who can attest to that.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you so much to everyone at Aspen for inviting us to be a part of this. And to be the opening panel is such a tremendous honor and, frankly, a huge amount of pressure. So I'm looking for a lot of smiles, a lot of laughs at my bad jokes in the audience today. That's where you all will come in. And to have no other than the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command here for this first conversation is really going to be a treat, I think. Admiral Aquilino is the 26th commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He is a Naval Academy graduate and a pilot of... Hello? Oh, no one wants to hear about your background here, apparently.
It's not a short list.
Hello, hello?
Check.
You want to share this one?
I think we might have to, because it looks like my battery might be out. Oh, thank you. Hello, hello. All right, let's try this again. He's still the commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, still a Naval Academy graduate. He flew F-14s and F-18s. He's a graduate of Top Gun. Come on. I know, right? He became the commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet in May of 2018, and he's been the commander of PACOM since April 30th of 2021. So, Admiral Aquilino, welcome.
Ms. Gordy, thank you very much. Great to see you again.
Thank you, too. And I also just, I know this isn't necessarily in his background, but I just want to run you through, this is a smart audience, but I just want to run you guys through some of the stats about PACOM to give you a sense of how huge his job is. More than half the world's population lives in the Indo-Pacific Command. 2/3 of the entire global economy flows through the region. There's over 35 countries, 7 of the world's 10 largest armies in Indo-PACOM, 5 of the world's declared nuclear nations, and some pretty sophisticated navies. So he's got a pretty big job, a lot of news, and I'm going to start with the news out of your region today. A U.S. soldier is in North Korean custody tonight for crossing the demarcation line, the DMZ, willfully, according to U.S. officials. Who is he and what happened?
Well, first, let me say thanks to the Aspen leadership for having me tonight. It's truly an honor. I also would like to welcome all of the local community that's here tonight. I know this is a special event. I'm honored to be here with you. The story hasn't really built much more than what's been reported. So he's a private from the U.S. Army, and again, it was willingly, and it was unauthorized. Made a run across the demilitarized zone in the joint security area, was picked up by the North Koreans, and we've had no contact at this point. But we're still doing our investigation to find out exactly what happened.
Is that the UN command that's investigating that then?
It is U.S. Forces Korea, forward stationed under General Paul LaCamera, that is doing all the work right now.
When you say there hasn't been contact, you haven't had contact with the U.S. soldier, but has there been communication between the U.S. and the North Korean in some capacity over this?
Not that I'm tracking yet.
Okay. There's some reports that he had some sort of a disciplinary action incident, and he was supposed to leave the country, and he took off out of the airport. Was somebody supposed to be watching him to make sure he got on a plane to leave Korea? Was there some sort of a breakdown in security here?
Yeah, I don't think we know enough quite yet to find that out. But I think those facts will come out in the next few days as we dig into it.
Is there any indication that this young man was a sympathizer for North Korea, and that's why he took off?
Again, we're gonna look into that. I've got no reports of that.
Also today, for the first time since about the 1980s, the U.S. sent a nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarine to South Korea, the USS Kentucky. This is capable of launching a ballistic missile, and this is very uncommon. Now, it was announced a couple months ago that this was likely to happen, but why send it there now?
Well, you say why send it there now? As military officers, we do a lot of planning. If somebody thinks we said today, hey, go pop that thing up and send it to to the South Korean port of Busan, that's just not what happened. That said, it's critical for the United States to demonstrate all forms of our national power to support our alliances. And we have a mutual defense treaty alliance with both Japan and Korea, and that means the entire United States Armed Force is ready to support those alliances. So demonstrating our willingness and our capabilities to our allies is reassuring. Last week we flew a B-52 bomber over the Korean Peninsula with South Korean fighters attached as escorts, along with U.S. fighters. Prior to arriving there, the Japanese joined up with the bomber. So we assure our allies and partners often, and this is just one of those demonstrations.
Do you expect that North Korea will respond, or is that why, I mean, they fired off some sort of a missile today? Do you think that was in response to this visit?
2 missiles today. We could make some assessment that their unhappiness with that visit could have been the cause for this event. That said, you know, they've been shooting missiles so frequently that I can't figure out what their justification is, other than their intent is to destabilize the region and threaten the allies and partners that we have in the theater. And I guess what I would say is, you know, the strategy is just not winning for them. What I mean by that is the alliances and partnerships in the regions are getting tighter. Just last week, General Milley came out to Hawaii with General LaCamera, and we hosted a trilateral event with our Korean counterparts and our Japanese counterparts. So the uniformed members of Japan, Korea, and the United States are working together more frequently and more easily. The leadership in both of our countries, not too long ago, President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida got together, and I thank them both for their willingness to take political risk to ensure that they can defend their nations. That trilateral relationship is important. It doesn't come without some long historical issues between the two, but the leadership in Japan and Korea right now, very, very impressive for what they're doing to defend their nations.
So North Korea has launched an unprecedented number of missiles in the last year or so, 2022, 2023. I mean, I know it's hard to say what their motivation is, but what do you think Kim Jong-un's end game is with all these launches?
I think his end game is to remain in power.
And what about the one recently, ICBM, solid fuel? I know that you guys don't like to talk about why that's so concerning, and I'm sure our audience already knows this because, like I said, you guys are pretty smart. But when you have a solid fuel rocket, there's less warning to others that it's potentially going to be launched off because they can take it out to a launch pad, they can stand it up, and they can fire it. You don't have a day or two of gassing the thing up before you fire it. So the fact that they now have demonstrated solid fuel ICBM, is that a game changer? And is there going to be some sort of a U.S. response in some way to that?
So I don't think it's a game changer. KGU is clearly working to advance his missile delivery capabilities. He's been doing it now consistently for the past almost 2 years. That is a goal that allows him to present a position of strength that he believes will enable the Kim regime to remain in place. That said, we continue to build our readiness with the forces on the Korean Peninsula to meet our responsibilities under the alliance. The forces at USFK are ready to respond. We continue to work with the other allies and partners in the region because the capability of that missile now just doesn't threaten South Korea or Japan or the United States. It threatens all nations in the region. And that should be concerning for all.
Can North Korea hit the continental U.S. with a nuclear-armed ballistic missile today?
The capability that they've delivered and demonstrated the other day, we assess, could reach the United States. The mating and all the nuclear capability is still being reviewed.
So the miniaturizing the warhead, it's not clear if they've achieved that capability yet. The IAEA also said several months ago that they appear to have reopened this nuclear testing site. There's been a lot of talk that they might test a nuke over the last few months, but they haven't. Do you think, are they actually going to test a nuke? And what does that mean for the region and the world if they do?
Boy, if I could figure out what he was going to do, like I always tell everybody, I wouldn't be here, I'd be in Vegas. But bottom line is he's made it capable such that if he chose, he could test another nuclear weapon. Game changing? I don't think so. He's already tested 7. What does it mean to the world? Is that his nuclear capabilities, the research and development continues. Oh, by the way, at the expense of the people of North Korea, because he's investing a lot of money to build those weapons of mass destruction. And again, it's taken food off the tables of those in North Korea. and you know, that needs to be highlighted. But will he do another nuclear test? I know he could. We'll see if he does.
Another alliance that you've talked about is the one between China and Russia. They've signed this recent no limits partnership. What exactly is this partnership? And have you seen any practical changes in your area since they've entered into it?
Yeah, I don't know what this partnership is. I'll use their words. It's a no limits relationship. And we've seen a lot of things that lead us to believe that it's truly real, despite their long historical and cultural differences. Let me start by just the sheer support from the CCP for the war, that the illegal, illegitimate war that the Russians are waging on Ukraine. That should be condemned, and the PRC has not done that. Additionally, they are amplifying the propaganda that the Russians are using. Their explanation is that NATO expansion was the cause of the invasion. That is just complete falsehood. So the PRC are supportive of the Russians. That's in that information space and as it applies to Ukraine. As it goes in the Pacific, they have amplified and increased their amount of joint training, joint exercises, and joint demonstrations. Just a month ago, bombers from both Russia and China, Russian bombers landed in China, and then they flew a joint mission into the Philippine Sea towards Guam. Today, a Russian and Chinese maritime task force is doing a combined patrol. We'll see where that ends up, whether it's off the Aleutian Islands, whether it's in the Philippine Sea, whether it goes to Guam, whether it goes to Hawaii, or whether it goes off the west coast of the United States. So their exercises have increased, their operations have increased. I only see the cooperation getting stronger, and boy, that's concerning. That's a dangerous world.
Is there any indication China is providing Russia with lethal aid that they're using in Ukraine?
I don't have any evidence of that at this point. We do think they are certainly supporting them, whether it be with intelligence or other means.
What's the current U.S. military assessment for when China may invade Taiwan? We're among friends here, right? Everyone's...
Well, let me start by talking about the things that the PRC, specifically President Xi Jinping, has said that shapes how we think about this. First, he has given the challenge to the Chinese military to be prepared, if required, to take Taiwan by force by 2027. All right, those are his words, not ours. Now, my job is to prevent that conflict, and we do that and work each and every day in order to prevent conflict. That said, if we think he's set his sight to be ready by 2027, I have that mission today. We need to be ready today. And we need to get our forces in place. We need to get the right capabilities. We need to have the right partnerships. And all of those things provide a strong deterrence to ultimately prevent the conflict, which is the goal. That said, if deterrence fails, our job is to fight and win. And I am confident, I'm extremely proud that the strongest military on earth is in the United States, and a lot of it's in the Pacific.
Are you confident that if China were to invade Taiwan today, that you have everything that you need to be able to defend them?
So nobody has everything they need.
Tell me about it.
If you show me that person. That said, there are a number of items that I've asked for specifically as a part of the budget process. The Deputy Secretary and the Secretary of Defense have been clearly supportive. They are aligned to a strategy-based budget focused on the China challenge, and I'm thankful for that. That said, with what we have today, I'm confident that they would fail.
What do you think could prompt President Xi to invade?
Once again, if I could tell you that, you know, there's a lot of things. Certainly there's some red lines that have been identified specifically by the Chinese. If there were a declaration of independence by Taiwan, that would be a serious concern. That said, let me just start by saying the United States policy as it applies to Taiwan has not changed. We work in accordance with the Taiwan's Relations Act, the 6 assurances and the 3 communiques. That is shapes the United States policy. We don't support independence on Taiwan, but we do support the peaceful resolution of the differences of people on both sides of the strait. And that's without coercion or action. No unilateral change to the status quo. And that's what we believe is the right place.
You said in some congressional testimony in April that the biggest challenge facing the U.S. is the speed of urgency at which we're working, because the U.S. has been at war in the Middle East for 20 years, and we need to understand how fast it's coming, and we need to go faster. Are you concerned that the time to deter China is running out?
I would like there to be, as I stated, an increased sense of urgency to deliver the capabilities that I've asked for, to do them in a time and a speed that's relevant. As I said, President Xi said he wants to be ready by 2027. We certainly ought to be ready before that if we're doing our jobs. We have been in a world where we have believed that Russia was going to, peace was going to break out with Russia, and there was no chance of a war in Europe. We had been living in a world where we believed that the PLA was going to integrate into the world international rules-based order in a way that was responsible. That's not the world we live in. So to be prepared and ready to live in that world, we ought to put all of our capabilities in place, our posture initiatives in place, our alliances and partnerships in place, and we ought to do that fast.
Do you think that the deterrence, frankly, not working with Russia may help your case to provide you with your, I mean, you have like $3.5 billion in unfunded priorities, many of which I imagine are focused on China, capabilities for China. Do you think the fact that Ukraine, the Russia did invade, despite the efforts at deterrence, might help your case in being able to prepare faster?
Yeah, I think, you know, I sat and watched my counterpart, General Walters, in testimony, and he got accused of not being able to deter President Putin. I think his mission was derived and tasked to ensure that NATO alliance was strong and that NATO was not invaded. So you could argue whether deterrence failed or not, but General Walters did some great work, followed up by General Cavoli. I'm not concerned that deterrence is failing in the Pacific. That said, we want to continue to position ourselves from a position of strength. We want our allies and partners to work and operate with us. We want to have all of those partners articulate the importance of the rules-based international order. There is a place for China in this world. China is not going away. That said, they need to integrate into the rules-based order in a way that's beneficial for all and not specifically at the benefit of the PRC. I'll give you this example, Courtney. The Global Security Initiative is China's term, although vague and without facts, for what the new rules-based order should look like. That is, you are hearing them lay the groundwork for what the rules should look like. Well, the deeds that I see look like this. A Chinese spy balloon flies directly over the continental United States. If that's what the Global Security Initiative looks like under Chinese rules, I'm pretty sure that's unacceptable to all nations. It's certainly unacceptable to the United States. And there are more examples of, you know, the say-do mismatch that we see. But we should be concerned about the way the PRC talks about the new rules-based order. The second example that I have to bring up is the International Tribunal that was filed by the Philippines in 2016 against the Chinese claim of all of the area inside the 9-dash line, and specifically on Second Thomas Shoal. Right? The International Court determined China had no valid claim. Yet they continue to threaten the Philippines. They have discounted the international ruling based on no fact other than they don't like the decision. So if the international rules-based order under Global Security Initiative just means as long as the PRC likes the outcome, then that's the rules. We ought to all be concerned about that.
Since you brought up the Chinese spy balloon, what is the spy balloon situation in your area? I mean, do you see them often? Is China flying these all the time and they're just not going over the continental US? And are you shooting any of the others of them down anywhere?
We have not seen one since the event, and I have not shot any down.
Not yet, but you got like a year left in the job, so you still have time.
I'm just trying to get through tomorrow.
I know. Well, the interview's not over yet, so. Another thing that we hear a lot about with China is their hypersonic capabilities. Are you concerned that China's capabilities at delivering hypersonic missiles to the US, are they more advanced than what the US has in hypersonics?
Let me start by saying what we're seeing is a military buildup second to none at the speed and rate at which it's being delivered. And it's not just hypersonic missiles, it's all capabilities. It's capabilities in the maritime environment, in the air domain, in space. Hypersonics and missile capability is one part of that. So, am I concerned about the buildup and the capabilities that they're delivering? Absolutely. That said, the United States continues to deliver capabilities that can ensure that we defend the homeland and protect our forces, and we'll continue to do that. So will they continue to develop? Absolutely. To include their nuclear capability. Largest buildup that we've seen, the fastest buildup in history.
Their August 2021 hypersonic test showed some real advanced capabilities. You were asked about it in testimony earlier this year. Are you confident that the US has the missile defense systems that they need, that they could actually knock one of those things down?
Well, I'm confident that the United States industry, innovation, we are developing those capabilities to ensure that we can do that.
Are you developing them fast enough?
Hence my point on urgency.
Do you have any contact with your Chinese counterparts?
I do not. Now, we invite them, and I have asked to speak to my Chinese counterparts, because there's more than one. The alignment is different. So the Eastern Theater Commander and the Southern Theater Commander, for 2 years now, I've had a request to speak with each of them. My asks have gone either unanswered or refused. We have invited the Chinese chairman to come to our annual Chiefs of Defense Conference. We're going to have that in Fiji next month. We have invited, we have not heard. We do it virtually 2 to 3 times per year. So in the 2 years, we've had one showing of the Chinese representation via teleconference. That's been the extent of my contact since I've been in this position.
The former STRATCOM commander, Admiral Richard, called China's nuclear breakout breathtaking. They have 3 new ICBM fields. Are they modernizing faster than the US? And is there anything that the US can do to discourage that? Or is there any impact the US can have on their modernization?
So it's critical that the U.S. continues our modernization of our strategic capabilities, and pretty costly, but required. It is the bottom line defense of this nation through strategic nuclear deterrence. That said, the Chinese are going very quickly. I'd have to go back and look and see how they equate it on a scale. Doesn't matter to me. What matters is that we modernize our force and we're ready to be able to respond if need be. I think we have, well, I know we have asked the Chinese to participate in some nuclear limitation talks, as well as with the Russians. They have not accepted that invitation either quite yet.
Has the US military conducted any war games with Taiwan?
All of our actions in accordance with Taiwan are aligned with the Taiwan's Relations Act. I'll just leave it there.
Doesn't the NDAA require, as of 2023, require that there be some war games?
I got to go back and look at the language.
It's a lot. It's really long.
We will always follow the law and meet the requirements.
Are you concerned that U.S. support for Ukraine, just billions of dollars in weapons and equipment that the U.S. has been sending there, that's depleting munitions specifically, but weapons that could go to Taiwan to help with this readiness issue?
Yeah, not at this point, Courtney. The United States is a global power, and I'd argue that after the invasion of Ukraine, we actually might be the only global power. So we can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's critically important that we support Ukraine. Strategically, it's critically important. And at this point, there's been nothing pulled out of my theater that limit me to do my job.
When you say walk and chew gum, is that a military way of saying that you can fight two conflicts at the same time? Like if China were to invade today, the U.S. could support in some way? I
think it's the way to say that as a global power, we can meet our global responsibilities.
One thing that's surprising to me about the Taiwan and the Ukraine, all of these weapons, is Taiwan has there's like $19 billion in weapons that are backlogged, that have been earmarked to go to Taiwan, that are just sitting and haven't been sent. And at this point, a lot of them may not get there before 2027. So how is it possible that with all these weapons and specifically munitions and long-range systems and air defenses that Taiwan needs, how is it possible when the U.S. is sending so many of those to Ukraine that's not having any impact on Taiwan? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's some different capabilities. Out of that $19 billion, a large chunk of that is F-16s that they have purchased. Again, at this point, like I said, I haven't seen any impact. The capabilities in some cases are different for the Pacific problem set than the overland problem set that's happening right now. But you bring up a good point about you keep making my sense of urgency argument. And I've had much conversation with industry on how they could speed up. Just-in-time defense support is not where we need to be anymore. So we got to build up the defense industrial base in a way where we can meet our requirements.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I think this is going to be your favorite part of the interview, because I feel like you're a 4-star, you have this prominent job, you got like 300,000, 50,000, 80,000 people under your command. But I bet that a lot of people don't know a lot about you. So let's change that right now. First off, your call sign is Lung. It's on your name tag there. Why?
Well, Aquilino turns into Aqualung. I wish I had a better story.
I know, you should, just for the record, you should make up a better story than that for the next time. Like something cool about saving someone by sticking a straw in their lung and they lived or something. I don't even know if that's a thing. You were a Top Gun pilot. What do you think of Top Gun Maverick? Do you roll your eyes at the Hollywoodization? I'm making up words left and right up here, by the way, of Top Gun, or is it cool?
Oh, it's cool.
Yeah?
Certainly there's some Hollywood portions of that, but there's a whole bunch of part of that movie that's real, and I don't know if it comes out, and I'll just give you a couple points. First, every one of those airplane scenes was an airplane flying with a U.S. Navy fighter pilot in the front seat. So that flying is all real. The dedication of those kids, I call them kids now because I'm old as dirt, but for those kids to get out there and do the mission, the dedication it takes, the hours that it takes to perfect your craft and be effective, that's the flying part of the scenes. If you were to look at the scenes on a U.S. aircraft carrier, those kids are killing themselves every day. Think about being in the Middle East and on the Gulf and working a 12 to 16-hour shift on a 140-degree flight deck launching airplanes for 12 hours. I'm proud every day to be able to work with those kids, and I'm in awe. When I was younger, I didn't get it, right? I feel like an old nostalgic dad. I watch those kids work, and I got almost 1,300 arrested landings. And every one of them took about 30 of those kids, mostly under the age of 25, to do everything they do perfectly for me to not die.
I wouldn't call you old, but since you brought it up, do you think you'll go anywhere after PACOM? Do you think there's another Navy job for you, or what do you think is your future?
Let me just go back to what I said. I hope to have this job tomorrow, and we'll see. I got enough on my plate, Courtney, I got the greatest team on the planet out in PACOM. I have a great amount of partners throughout the regions. Almost all the chiefs of defense that are out there I call friends. I got a lot of work to do before I worry about what's next.
Was there ever a point in your career where you thought, oh, I just messed up, I'm going to get fired?
Yeah, I wish there was only one. We'll wait till after I retire to have that conversation.
And just one more. Since you're the head of PACOM, do you think that PACOM should stay in Navy billet? Or do you think it's possible that that could go to another service?
Well, I think when the secretary takes a look at however he's going to fill it, there's a ton of qualified officers, an amazing amount of talent that I've been able to work with over the past, hell, I'm going on almost 40 years. So I'm confident that whatever the secretary decides to fill behind me will be a qualified and really amazing officer. It's a joint force. That said, there's a lot of water out there.
Yeah. Admiral Aquilino, can I call you Lung?
Only my friends do, so yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for making the trip here.
Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you, Courtney, for that hard-hitting, intelligent, thoughtful interview. We're going to remember two things: that Top Gun is very cool, and that Admiral Aquilino and his whole team are really not slackers out there keeping us safe in the Pacific. So thank you all so much. I now have the great privilege, and really, we are lucky. We're doing a tour around the world. We're going from the Pacific all the way to East Africa. And we are just so honored to have with us Dr. Monica Juma, who is currently the National Security Advisor of Kenya, but has held pretty much every other job in the Kenyan cabinet. She was Cabinet Secretary for Defense, for Foreign Affairs, and was in the docket energy. I mean, she's done pretty much every job in the Kenyan government, and this is a complicated area of the world. We hear constantly about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We hear very little about what's going on in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa and the death and devastation that's happened there. Dr. Juma lives that every day. And Kenya, of course, is also an important partner to the United States. I was just there a few months ago. I was stunned by your young people and the budding economy and the tech economy you're building, and how much Kenya is really the commercial hub of that region. So we're very grateful to have you here. And to interview her is Sarah Smith from the BBC. Thank you both. Come on up.
Hello, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here at Aspen, and I know we're all going to have a great time for the next few days, and a fascinating 30 minutes ahead of us, because it really is fantastic to be able to welcome Dr. Monica Juma. As Anya said, she's held many posts in the Kenyan government, but also had a very distinguished career as an international diplomat, and would appear to be a great survivor, because you were defense minister under the previous President Kenyatta, and now you're national security advisor to the incoming President William Ruto, and they weren't on the same side in this election. So how did you manage to make the transition?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's the first time a Kenyan is sitting in Aspen, at least in this beautiful part of the world, so very delighted to be amongst this distinguished crowd. For the first time, I saw Joseph Nia, who we looked to as we were students of international relations, so thank you very much. Sarah, that question should go to the president, isn't it? And I don't think it's unusual to have crossovers, so I'm just one of those.
How much difference will it make to international relations with Kenya, to US relations with Kenya, this change of presidency, though? It was widely celebrated last year when there was a peaceful transfer of power after a pretty narrow election, and William Ruto took over the presidency. Will that involve any significant change for the US and other Kenyan allies?
Well, the change has been that we are on a road to deepening that relationship, and we were, I think, very lucky to have Meg Whitman there as the ambassador. And so we've had a lot of engagement since President Ruto came in. So we are pleased that it is a continuation in terms of nurturing that relationship within a very structured, it's very structured. We have a bilateral strategic dialogue. It is very well defined across several sectors: security, economy, trade and investment, people-to-people relations. So we are seeing greater cooperation and deepening of relations.
And of course, Kenya has long been a US ally. It's the most stable democracy in East Africa. You've got a dynamic and growing economy, all of which looks incredibly positive, but at the same time surrounded by potentially devastating conflicts and dealing with the terrible effects of a very severe drought throughout the region, threatening up to 20 million people with hunger over the coming years, which also demonstrates the climate vulnerability that Kenya is facing. So it's a long and rather depressing list, but if you had to pick the biggest national security challenge that Kenya is facing, could you name one?
Well, like most of the world, of course, terrorism is one of the biggest threats, you know. We have next to us Al-Shabaab, and a growing network between Al-Shabaab and other international terrorist organizations. And in a situation of fragility and the threat to state collapse within the neighborhood, that has the potential to provide the environment for recruiting, for training, for deploying, for planning terrorist actions. So, top of my head, terrorism is the greatest threat.
And Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia, obviously. There are Kenyan troops there at the moment as part of an international force to try and counter Al-Shabaab. But troops are being withdrawn. Another 3,000 will leave by the end of September. They will be completely withdrawn by the end of 2024. And there are some inside Somalia warning that they think the country's not ready. Do you think Somali Defense Forces are ready to take on this challenge alone?
It's a big challenge, and Somalia has been without a government for more than 3 decades. So the threat in terms of capabilities are real, you know, and there's been a lot of discussions. Linda here will tell you that this is a live file in the UN Security Council. Those of us near have been urging and encouraging that this withdrawal be condition-based. But we have also been calling for cooperation and partnership in order to build the capacity of the Somali state. This is really crucial because if we don't have a state that can provide public safety and security, that can provide social services, that can take away and recover the population from the grip of the Al-Shabaab, then all the investments we've made in the last couple of years could be lost just by that withdrawal. And that is why we've been making contact with partners to try and think through what a stabilization program for Somalia could look like. We believe it's not expensive. We believe it can be done. And part of it is really to boost and to provide some good quantum for state capability to function.
So what would you be asking of anybody you meet here in order to help provide that? Because of course, Al-Shabaab have launched attacks inside Kenya. They are capable of operating internationally. They pose a threat beyond their own borders. What would you be asking the international community to do to try and prepare for this moment at the end of 2024 when the international forces will be gone?
Well, the first one is really to provide resources. Somali operations and support have been very poorly supported generally. And the stabilization can take a part in terms of focusing on certain key actors, sectors. For example, it is crucial that the state has the capacity to hold territories that have been taken away. There's been a lot of focus towards creating the national army with all sorts of challenges to that. Some of us feel that there needs to be investment in local public safety capabilities, policing functions, administrative functions, ability to provide primary health care, ability to make sure that schools can function, markets can function, and so forth, capacity to collect and manage taxes, because we know Al-Shabaab lives off of taxing people either for protection and other services. And we believe that it is possible to have a program where the neighboring states, for example, Kenya, can offer, and we have done so, our institutions to boop up the capacity of state functionaries that can actually undertake all these functions quickly. As I've said, it is not expensive, but it is something, it's a conversation that we are not getting a lot of traction with.
And that's becoming more urgent, presumably, as you're looking at 18 months hence, what could be a very dangerous situation in that country.
It is becoming very urgent. Again, to Admiral,
yes.
I think it's very important to understand that an investment in security is really investment in the prosperity of our people and countries. So it is urgent. We also believe that there is need to look at Al-Shabaab as a terrorist organization that can really deliver a lot of challenges and a lot of violence and a lot of disruption to Somalia, but also to the neighborhood. And so within Nairobi, we've been for a long time campaigning for the listing of Al-Shabaab. And that is an important thing so that we can all deploy the range of instruments that can actually curtail their influence both within Somalia but across the region and beyond.
The UK Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, is about to leave his post, which always means people can be a little bit more outspoken when they're leaving a job. And he said the other day that one of his biggest fears for international security is the UK and allies being drawn into a shooting war in Africa as Al-Qaeda or affiliates like Al-Shabaab are threatening the future of nation states. And he said he was particularly worried about Somalia. Is that an exaggerated fear that Western allies could be drawn into a shooting war in Africa because of what's happening there?
Well, unfortunately, it's not very far away. The effects of what is happening in Somalia or Sudan today can reach out here very quickly. So it's not far away, and we have to pay attention.
Do you think the US is paying attention to this?
The US has been paying very close attention to Somalia, and we have been working very closely with the US in Somalia. But I think we need a global view. For example, we don't feel that there is a look at the region holistically. You know, there is a tendency to focus on country by country. But the threats, if you look at them, they are interlinked. So we are looking at conflict formations. We are looking at risk portfolios that are related to one another across the entire theater. And so we're talking about countries, but we're also talking about the Indian Ocean, so that you can look at the Indian Ocean realm as part of that theater of interest that we should be looking at all times.
And you mentioned Sudan, which we should talk about as well, but just so I clearly understand what you're saying. So in Somalia, you have an Al-Shabaab Islamic terrorist insurgency. In Sudan, what's happened in the last 4 months is quite different. You have an attempted coup going on there with a paramilitary force taking on the government army. What are what's the commonality there that you're talking about, that we should see it more holistically?
What we have seen with terrorism anywhere in the world is that they take advantage of ungoverned spaces. They take advantage of crisis. And so when you have a threat, a situation like the one evolving in Sudan, where the state is actually under the threat of collapse, complete state collapse and fragmentation, where in fact we are having fighting groups from beyond Sudan, all the way being drawn from the Sahel, all the way to the end of the Sahel, as we hear. So we are talking about a transnational force that is not necessarily under the control of even the belligerents. And we are seeing an appetite to create those linkages into the Sahel. We know we already have terrorist groups there. We know we have them in DR Congo, Eastern DR Congo. We know the Central African Republic is very fragile. We know there is a connection between Al-Shabaab and northern Mozambique. And so I think we have to look at this as interconnected theaters. And all the time, these actors are drawing on each other, whether it is in terms of ideology, whether it is in terms of fighting forces, and whether it is in terms of the planning and execution of their plans to attack the various countries and people or societies.
Because we have a very well-connected and very well-informed audience here, so I'm sure they know just how awful the fighting in Sudan has been, and the UN Secretary General saying they're on the brink of a full-scale civil war there. But what is it the Rapid Support Forces want to achieve in Sudan, those who are taking on the government?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I don't know. What is certain is that they are causing untold suffering, destruction. We know that my president has actually used a stronger word. He has referred to what is unraveling in Darfur as a genocide, and I think we need to pay attention. It seems to us, when you look at Darfur today, you begin to recall the scenes of Darfur in 2003. So I think we need to pay very close attention to what is going on in the Sudan. And I think this country cannot forget that the journey to 9/11 began in Sudan.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important to pay attention to what is going on there.
So 20 years since we were talking about genocide in Darfur, and in that time there's been a UN mission in Sudan, an African Union mission. How has it come to the point where things are almost as bad now as they were 20 years ago?
I think it is proof that we didn't do our jobs right. Something went wrong. An AU mission, a UN mission, 15, 16 billion US dollars down the line, and we are talking about villages being ravaged down. We're talking about more than 270 refugees in Chad, tens of thousands in South Sudan, actually threatening another very fragile country. Same with CAR, Egypt facing the same situation. It seems to me that there was something we didn't do right. And I think the big question that we must ask now is what went wrong and how can we engage in a manner that doesn't take us there in another decade.
And what do you think that might be?
Well, first of all, I think there has been a lot of impunity with Sudan. And we have to pay attention to when crimes have been committed, people have to be held to account. A lot of crimes are unfolding in Sudan. And a lot of times when you listen to people, there is not clarity in calling out those crimes. And we are not just having cities destroyed, we are having civilians being war efforts, we are having women being raped repeatedly, we are having people being killed. In Darfur, we are having villages being razed to the ground. So, but we haven't had a lot of condemnation, have we? Or even call. Instead, we are having belligerents who, in fact, obstructed a process towards the aspiration of the Sudanese people. We are focusing on those, and a lot of conversations are around those two gentlemen, or generals. And I think we need to focus on the people and the aspiration of the Sudanese people for democratic governance.
Talking about the generals, though, and accountability, General Hamdan, the leader of the RSF, he was warned by the United States that he would face consequences if he tried to seize power in Sudan, and he hasn't. Nothing has happened. There have been no sanctions, no attempt to punish him for doing exactly what he was warned not to do. That's why Senator Chris Coons is urging a comprehensive set of sanctions should be imposed on this coup leader, but the Biden administration doesn't seem ready to do that.
Well, I wouldn't answer for the Biden administration as well.
But what do you think about the fact that there have been no consequences?
What I can say, from Nairobi, it is very, very clear that the crisis in Sudan, in fact, it's not one crisis. There are a number of crises that are unfolding in Sudan. And the first thing that we need to do is to decouple those crises so that we do not have a situation where we cannot resolve them because we haven't agreed on all of them. The first crisis that is urgent is the humanitarian crisis. And so conversations around getting humanitarian assistance into Sudan is urgent and now. The numbers of people affected and impacted. So we have thought that the decisions around creating humanitarian corridors and securing humanitarian assets to make sure that assistance gets through where it is most needed must be the first, a set of responsibility for a number of actors that are engaged in this. And Martin Griffith, OCHA, has been leading in this initiative, but they have been receiving a lot of difficulties of access. So there needs to be some serious conversations to demand observation, at least of the international humanitarian law, in the event that we cannot get the stopping of the war, so that the humanitarian action can proceed. Secondly, is the question around silencing the guns. It is absolutely essential that the war comes to an end if this country is going to turn around, and that happens quickly. And that is why we believe that the Jeddah initiative was important in terms of trying to secure some degree of cessation of hostilities. We think that cessation of hostilities should be permanent so that it can allow for the recovery and normalization, hopefully, of the Sudan. But the third and very important component is the political process, which in fact was subverted. We know of the revolution. We know that the Sudanese people had clearly defined their aspiration for a democratic dispensation. This was subverted, and it requires, we need to reset back to it. There's a lot of debate, because somewhat the two sides do not like this idea that the civilians can take charge. But this is about Sudan, and the people of Sudan have a right to determine how they wish to be governed. And we take the view from Nairobi that this is urgent. Any of these issues should be taken up. They can run concurrently, they can reinforce one another, but they should not be clamped together, because that means if one doesn't move, then everything else stalls and people continue suffering.
To what extent does Kenya now see itself as a regional leader when it comes to these kind of things? I mean, you're the most stable democracy, the most prosperous country in the region. Is it your responsibility to get involved in each one of these conflicts and attempt to try and find some kind of resolution?
Historically, we have always availed ourselves to try and solve these types of situations. And in Sudan, as in DR Congo and Somalia, we have not had any choice. The president and the administration feels they have a duty in the region, and so we have offered ourselves. The president is chairing the IGAD quartet. He has been in engagement with all the neighborhood of Sudan, and I think we are not moving as quickly as we would wish, but I think there is an agreement of the imperative to cohere, to coordinate around the region in order that we can drive towards the ending of this conflict and the restoration of the process of peace building, but importantly of governance by the civilian dispensation in Sudan.
And looking at slightly wider international relations, Kenya, like a lot of Africa, is being wooed, I would say, quite heavily by the US at the moment. America's making a huge effort in Africa, and President Biden himself said he's all in on Africa, all in with Africa. But it's nakedly transparent, isn't it, that the reason this effort is being made in Africa is to counter Chinese influence in the global south. Does it matter why it is that the US is trying to establish better relations, putting in more money, paying more attention to Africa?
Well, I think the U.S. effort is historical. I mean, U.S. has a long history with many countries on the continent. I think any wooing of Africa at this time is right. If you look at the strategic issues, and let me just speak to climate action. If we are going to move towards net zero, urgent as it is, I think the best way to do this is to look at the global south, and in particular to Africa, because you are looking at the diversified set of resources that are critical for green growth, whether you're talking about minerals, or whether you're talking about renewable energy, or whether you're talking about the carbon sinks and things like that. So it is rational to look at Africa in terms of the climate action. If you're talking about trade and investment, you're talking about a region that is 1.2 billion people, young people, so it's a big market. and it provides opportunity both for the continent, but also for America and any other region that wishes to engage for investment and prosperity. So I don't think it's about wooing, it's about looking at opportunities and trying to leverage those opportunities.
And is it, I mean, Kenya looks as though it's pivoting away from China a bit at the moment. Billions of dollars were spent building infrastructure projects that were lent by China, but now you're trapped with that debt as global interest rates are rising, and President Ruto has said he won't be looking for Chinese investment for any more projects like this at a time when you're welcoming in the Americans. Is that a political pivot, or is that just a coincidence that that's happening now?
Well, it's being pragmatic. If you have a huge debt, you need to deal with it, okay? And that's not just a Kenyan problem. I think it's a global problem, and we could all have statistics for everywhere. So I think what we are doing is we are looking at what are the next steps. We are making very tough decisions. President Ruto is making very, very tough decisions because he has pronounced himself around reducing borrowing. In terms of climate action, he's been on the forefront of arguing for the right architecture because there should not be a contradiction between responding to crisis emergencies and development. They are not mutually exclusive, and it is possible to go on the green growth path without necessarily, and actually we can't do it on our balance sheet. It is not possible, not with the current infrastructure, financing infrastructure that we are having. So I think it's a matter of looking at the moment in history and asking the questions. Do we have the infrastructure to respond to our future, to the current challenges, and to the opportunities that the context we live in provides? And answering that question will take you to a different place in terms of changing the infrastructure of development as we know it today.
And it does feel as though we're at a major tipping point or inflection point globally. And we know the Biden administration has nailed its colours very firmly to the mast over Ukraine, but internationally, saying that they're worried about the rise of autocracy and very ready to support and defend democracy. What does that mean for Kenya and your region?
Well, for Kenya, it's very clear what it means. We see our future and our prosperity being best realized within a democratic dispensation. And we have been on a path of deepening our democratic credentials, as you indicated. But we also know that we cannot realize that prosperity as an island. And so the region matters. And the fragility in the region is not a good thing for our democratic prosperity. And so there is need to engage. And that is part of the raison d'etre, why we are engaged in the region, to try and contribute to the pursuit of peace and security, but also to contribute towards democratic, deepening democratic practices and governance. And so we have all manner of collaboration with our neighborhood. But I think this has got to be contextualized globally. Democracy is under duress globally. And I think we have to ask fundamental questions around how can democracy be linked to improved livelihoods of people? How can we focus also on socioeconomic rights? How can we engage in development that supports improvement of values of life? So really there's a fundamental question around how do we incentivize for democratic practice?
Because most democratic proponents would assume that what you describe comes along with a democracy, but you're saying it cannot be taken for granted, and people need to be incentivized to understand the value of the democracy.
That's true. I think that is true. And let me just take an example. In relation to what you asked me, what is our greatest risk? Terrorism. We have seen terrorist agents take advantage of democratic spaces, protected democratic spaces, schools, churches, to recruit, to train, to deploy. So how do we protect these spaces so that the freedom of association, the freedom of areas of worship, protection of areas of worship is not subverted for insidious aims and activities such as terrorism. Similarly, we are having a young population on the African continent. How do we make sure that we can drive development that offers employment, dignified jobs, you know, and good value of life? Because if you don't do that, then these young people become the bands that are ready to be recruited, to be gangs, to get into cells, terrorist cells and things like that. So we have to link consciously our development to democratic credentials. Otherwise, we run a risk of having growth rates that do not translate into value of life, to good value of life.
And you identified terrorism as the greatest problem now, but the region is already suffering the drought that we already mentioned as a result of climate change, a drought the worst in 4 decades, and we fear with more to come. With the movements of people, with the poverty that will bring, will you reach a point where actually climate change is more of a threat to security than terrorism?
Climate threat is it's an existential threat. And I think it's not a Horn of Africa problem. It is a global threat to all of us. And when you look at the figures in terms of the emissions, it really doesn't matter that America's emissions are lessening, or Europe, because the frontier markets are emitting in larger percentages. And when you look at cumulatively, the trajectory is raising. And so we are really not within the margins that science tells us we have to be in. So climate crisis is a big, big threat. It is impacting security. It is impacting the ability of countries to drive development, because when you start transferring your money from your development kitty to respond to emergencies, then you're having a problem. And if it is combined with drought, lack of rainfall, which means then you don't have food security, it means you run into emergency situation, it means you cannot service your debts, it also puts a lot of pressure on your fiscal space, then it translates into insecurity, not just for the individuals, but for countries.
And that's, well, we know that's a very real coming threat. I feel that we've probably thoroughly depressed everybody on this opening night with a run around all of these very, very worrying conflicts and problems, which feels unfair because Kenya is really a remarkable success story in the region as well.
This was, like Anya said when we started, this was not meant to depress anyone. Let me turn it around. Let me turn it around. In this region, in spite of all that we are having, there is a lot of possibilities. A lot of possibilities to start with in terms of climate action. I have said, we are sitting in a region of diversified assets, ready, that can actually be invested upon to reduce both the emissions in terms of decarbonization, but also to build resilience in these countries, to provide what you are talking about, whether it is job opportunities, whether it is in terms of quality of life, food security, and so forth and so forth. But I am also sitting in a country where we believe in digital transformation. And here is another area for this continent, not just for Kenya, in terms of the possibility for transforming societies, digital transformation, Silicon Savannah we have out there. Anybody that has been in Kenya will know the bubbliness of that country in terms of the technological advancement and the possibilities. So herein, again, huge opportunities for not just American companies, but for everybody to actually drive the new world, which is digital in character. But we are also having the possibility for the deepening of the democratic credentials. It is true we are having fragility, but hey, that is the journey that every country has to go to walk. And so I don't think it's about these difficulties are not really they are overwhelming to us as individuals, but I think that is why I appeal for global partnerships, solidarity, so that we can all work together, because a stable, peaceful Africa is good for the world.
Thank you.
A stable, peaceful Africa is good for the world, and we're very lucky to have Dr. Juma with us, who is at the front lines of making that happen. We have one more wonderful session for you all this evening, a very short session, but we are so lucky to have with us Linda Thomas Greenfield. She is one of our most distinguished career diplomats. She was a senior diplomat when I was a baby staffer at the State Department in the mid-2000s, running our Africa policy, later Assistant Secretary for Africa, and of course now, really in the hot seat. She is our representative to the United Nations and votes the UN Security Council seat for the United States. So she is really at the front lines of all of these issues. And no one better to talk to her about those things than Andrea Mitchell, who of course is the White House correspondent and Chief National Security Correspondent of NBC. Thank you both.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be back here in Aspen. Wonderful to be here at the Security Forum. Our thanks to them for this great invitation to interview a real hero of the American Foreign Service and of our ambassadors' ranks, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who's been with the Foreign Service for more than 30 years, was a pathbreaker in every sense of the word, and has continued to be the forefront of our diplomacy and a member of the cabinet. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here.
Thank you.
It's a great privilege.
Delighted to be here.
And I should say she has just flown in, so we're all adjusting together to the altitude.
Adjusting to the altitude.
Yes.
I said, don't turn the mic on while I'm breathing deeply.
Yes. Let me ask you about some news of the day and how it fits into a larger context, because a private second class, Travis King, is now in North Korean custody. He bolted across the border at the DMZ after attaching himself to a traveling group, a commercial traveling group at the airport in South Korea when he was being escorted by the military to go home after he had gotten into some legal difficulties. He'd already experienced his punishment there and was heading home. And I know this is a Pentagon issue. It is also an issue for the State Department. But as we've been reporting all day, the US communicated that this was willful, unauthorized, and to Pyongyang, immediately got confirmation of that communication, but has heard nothing since that we know of. And this is part of a larger problem. For the past 2 years, more than 2 years, the administration has tried to reach out to the North Koreans on all of the nuclear missile issues after multiple violations of UN resolutions, as Pyongyang has just escalated its program to the point where it is reaching the precipice. So how do we break through communications before it's too late?
Well, first and foremost, the DPRK has broken numerous Security Council resolutions. There have been over 20 tests in 2023 alone. And as you noted, we have made an effort to engage diplomatically with this government. President Biden made that offer on day one, and that offer is still on the table, that we're willing to engage with them at the diplomatic table. They've not accepted, but it's not for lack of trying on our side. In the Security Council, we have brought DPRK to the table to consultations and open meetings over and over and over again. We've been blocked consistently by the Chinese from issuing any product to have the Security Council condemn their actions. But we've been very, very clear that if there's a nuclear test, we will put a resolution on the table. We have over 100 countries that have signed on to be co-sponsors, and we will put pressure on China to engage. They engaged with us in the past when we got the resolutions passed before. And they have to come back to the table with us, because the DPRK is not just a threat to the United States, it's not just a threat to the Republic of Korea and to Japan. They are a threat to the world. And I've said many times to my Chinese counterpart, they are a threat to China.
Is China in some ways embracing this because they see us on the back foot? They don't see it as an immediate threat to them. They would rather see instability in the peninsula.
I can't speak for the Chinese, but I can say that they have encouraged and empowered the DPRK by not allowing the council to take action. And they really have to move away from that position because they are a threat. The DPRK is a threat to international peace and security.
I want to talk to you more about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which I know is a top priority for you and for the Secretary. But most immediately, one of those goals is to end world hunger by 2030. And now Russia has just cut off the grain exports from Ukraine through the Black Sea. And this will increase world food prices, exacerbate famine in the global south, and arguably around the world. So is there any way that you see communications that you have at the UN or that we have with Moscow getting Putin to back down on this blockade?
The UN has led the negotiations with the Russians on this, with the support of the government of Turkey. And they are still engaging in those negotiations. They're still pushing. And I even saw that President Erdogan said he was still hopeful that they can get to a place where the Russians will go back into the deal. Millions of people are going to suffer, and this is just one more example of the callousness and the cruelty of Putin. He pulled out of this deal, and then he vetoed the resolution. You and I traveled to the border of Turkey and Syria, and you saw how important that border crossing was to feeding millions of people on the Syrian side of the border. And the Russians vetoed that at the same time that they pull out of this grain deal. So they don't care about people, and we have to continue to condemn them, keep the pressure on them, and find a way forward with or without them.
That area of Syria with millions of refugees who were being bombed by Russia, by Russia as proxy for Damascus, that area was devastated by the earthquake in February and subsequent aftershocks. So those people have had multiple hits. They were in that refugee camp because of the bombing by the regime. So how can you break through? Having seen this firsthand, you go every year, and now the last corridor, there were 4 corridors, now the last one has been vetoed.
They not only vetoed the last resolution, they put on the table a resolution that was totally unacceptable to all 14 members of the Security Council. 13 of us opposed it, the Chinese abstained, and only Russia voted against this resolution. And then they put their resolution on the table where 13 of us opposed it. China voted with Russia on Russia's resolution, which would have allowed for basic recognition of this regime's attacks and cruelty on its own people. They want the international community to pay for reconstruction and recovery in areas that were bombed and destroyed by this regime, and we could not accept that, even with their dangling a 6-month extension in front of us. So we're still in the process of negotiating and putting pressure on Russia. The UN is meeting with Assad to see if we can find a way forward I don't think the Assad regime wants to take the responsibility for feeding the people that are even under their control. So I think it's important for them to see us find a path forward.
On another aspect of these, very difficult relationships, the Pentagon is telling us that there are almost daily very close calls between Russian and American aircraft in what should be a deconfliction zone over Syria.
Yeah.
How concerned are you and the United Nations of a disastrous occurrence?
Russia has become a pariah state around the world. 143 countries have condemned their actions in Ukraine. And they are on their back foot, as we heard earlier, and they are desperate. And I described them in the Security Council as a bully on the playground who they can't get their way, so they just keep threatening the world. And the world is suffering. Food prices are going up. There are shortages, and it's being impacted more in the global south than anywhere else in the world.
One of the impacts of the war and of COVID have been to really set back the goals of the Sustainable Development. In 2015, it was to eliminate poverty and hunger and gender equality by 2030.
Yeah.
And now, how difficult is it to even think about achieving those goals, and what would be the new forecast?
It's a challenge. We're at the halfway mark, and we will be having a SDG summit in September during High Level Week. And at the halfway mark, only 12%, 12 of the goals only 12% of the goals have been reached, and half of them we have not made very much progress on. So there's a desperation now to really ramp up our efforts and show the world that we are serious and we're committed to reaching these goals. One of the goals, and we work on all of them, but one of the goals that's most important to me is the goal of ending hunger. And we will be president of the Security Council in August, and this is my third presidency where I have made hunger the centerpiece. And some have asked, why do you keep doing the same thing over and over? And the reason, the answer to that is we haven't ended it yet. And we're dealing with famine in the Horn of Africa, where we are very proud that we averted the famine last year. But what we're not saying is that hundreds of people still died. And we have to find a way. We have the tools. We have the know-how to end hunger. And I was delighted to have a conversation with Senator Coons and Senator Lindsey Graham, who have been working together to put forward a bill and a resolution that will address hunger by bringing the private sector in and do more work with the private sector to address issues of hunger worldwide.
There's bipartisan support, as you just point out, in Congress. Is this one of the issues where the UN Security Council framework is just inadequate to the problem, given the Russian veto in China?
You know, we have a Security Council that was created 70 years ago.
Right.
And it was created 70 years ago to deal with the issues of the world 70 years ago. Today, those issues have changed, and the construct of the world has changed. Most of the countries of Africa, almost all of them, were not independent then. So President Biden announced, and we have been addressing that issue over the course of the past year, that we support reform of the Security Council that will include additional permanent members from Africa, from Latin America, as well as additional elected members of the Security Council. And we have committed to that, and we've been coordinating and consulting across the globe to see how we can move that agenda forward.
Of course, the backdrop for a lot of these problems is the Ukraine war. I was just returning from Vilnius and covered the NATO summit, and you spoke with Foreign Minister Kuleba afterwards. Obviously, Ukraine was very distressed by the way the communique was drafted. And frankly, there was criticism of the US, splitting with some of its NATO allies on this issue, as not giving them a better time frame for when they could accede after the war. No one's arguing during the war, but after the war, of when they could accede to NATO.
Look, we understand Ukraine's frustration, but NATO has been united in how it has addressed Ukraine, and we expressed a strong commitment and plans that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And what that will require to get there is in process right now. There's a commitment to the Ukrainians. And again, let me just say, when President Putin made the terrible mistake of invading Ukraine, he thought that NATO would be divided. NATO has never been stronger, and NATO has never been stronger in terms of its policy of an open door and allowing Ukraine's membership eventually into NATO.
How critical is this moment of the counteroffensive, which President Zelensky has acknowledged is facing very tough Russian defenses and is slowing down? It's tough going, given the terrain right now.
You know, it's, again, you have to be extraordinarily proud of what the Ukrainians have been able to accomplish. Because, again, I think Putin believed that he could go into Ukraine and in 2 weeks bring this country to its knees. And it has not done that. And then you're seeing internal fights happening in Russia right now. So while the counteroffensive is not moving as fast as President Zelensky wanted it to move, Russia also is not moving any faster in trying to capture more of Ukraine. So they are pushing back on the Russians, but it's because they have unified, strong support from Europe and from NATO.
In the past, you had a relationship with your Russian counterpart at the UN. More than 500 days into this war, are those days over?
So Russia sits in the Security Council, and we all sit around the table. So I have to sit around the table with the 15 members of the Security Council. And clearly, Ukraine is a huge, huge barrier for a normal relationship with the Russians, for all of us sitting on the Security Council. But we also have to deal with issues where we agree. We just voted on a resolution on Haiti, and all 15 countries voted for it. And we engaged at the working level with the Russians to get their agreement on that.
Can you engage at the working level with the Russians to free Evan Gerskovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter?
I engaged directly with my counterpart on that.
Is there any progress at all? He's wrongfully detained. He's not a spy. And he has no prospect of getting out. Are there back channels?
Yeah, the president has indicated that this is the highest priority for him, and every single member of his national security team, we work on this issue every single day. And I have engaged directly with my Russian counterpart on this issue. His response is he will convey it to Moscow, but I think they're hearing it from all of us, and they know that it's an issue. And the president has made clear that we will not stop until we free Evan, but also free Paul Whelan.
Paul Whelan and Mark Fogel.
And all Americans who are unlawfully detained and unfairly detained. And you may have seen in the Security Council when Russia was president of the Security Council, I invited Paul Whelan's sister and had her in the audience, and I asked her to stand and look at Lavrov. And he
That was
looked at
quite a
it.
moment.
It was quite a moment.
You said last year when Russia used cluster munitions that they have no place on the battlefield. Is the U.S. losing its moral high ground by now providing them to Ukraine?
Look, we have made clear that Ukraine is defending itself against a brutal aggressor. And Russia used these munitions against Ukraine in an attack on Ukraine. And we have to remind ourselves every day that Ukraine is defending its democracy, it's defending its sovereignty, it's defending its independence. And the president has been clear that we will do everything. We will stand by Ukraine until they defeat the Russians.
Do you have concerns about congressional support given some of the recent statements by Republicans, and actually some Democrats, but mostly by Republicans in the House?
The president consulted with members of Congress. He consulted with our allies. And as he said, it was a difficult decision, but it was the right decision.
Do you have concerns about the next supplemental, which is going to be necessary to continue the military aid?
I'm not. There is bipartisan support for that. There are clearly individuals on the Hill who oppose it, but there is broad bipartisan support because we know that this is important. It's about the defense of the international order. And again, it's the charter, the UN charter that we all signed on to. It's the values that underpin that charter that we're fighting for. And Ukraine is on the front lines of that. And we all have to support them as they defend our interests.
As much as the Ukraine war has, with the efforts of the president and the administration, brought NATO and Western allies together, it has deepened the divide between the West, the US, and the global South. What do we do about the relationship with India, Brazil, South Africa, major countries?
You know, Andrea, I wouldn't say that it has deepened the divide. I think what it has led to is a much more intense conversation about what our priorities are and how we can promote those priorities across the globe. I heard the Admiral say we can chew gum and walk at the same time. Secretary Blinken says we also have not forgotten the rest of the world. We can row. And so Russia's narrative is that we have turned against the global South. But the truth is we have not. We continue to engage with the global South. We continue to engage with our partners, as you heard with Kenya. We're still addressing issues of global peace and security, dealing with Sudan, working on Haiti. We have not turned our backs on the global South, but we have worked diligently to defend what even the global South has to be concerned about, an aggressor crossing the border into a smaller neighbor. And it can happen to any of those countries, and we will be there for them as well.
Do you think that message is getting communicated?
I think it's getting across. But, you know, Russia has an extraordinary propaganda machine, and they use it very, very effectively. And we all know that we have to up our game. And that was one of the issues I discussed with Foreign Minister Kuleba. It's something that we discuss with our European colleagues. We didn't just discover Africa, as you heard. We have been there with the continent since the beginning. We are very close to this continent. And we do have to ramp up and amplify our messaging on our commitments and our priorities to addressing the issues that are important to them.
The UN has started focusing on artificial intelligence. There was a meeting, in fact, today, and how it affects, or, you know, can threaten misinformation in the democratic processes. This issue is so hard for the United States and regulators to even grapple with. There's a lot of lack of understanding, and it's evolving so quickly. How can a bureaucracy as cumbersome, frankly, as the United Nations even come to grips with it?
They have to. They are working on that, and I was very pleased that the UK had this as their signature event today. Their foreign minister sat in the chair. We see this as a double-edged sword. AI can be an extraordinary tool for the world, for dealing with issues of hunger, for dealing with issues of health, for dealing with education across the world, but it also has a negative side, and those things have to be regulated, and it is only the UN that can regulate it for the world.
I want to ask you about Israel because, of course, President Herzog is in Washington, met with the Secretary of State, met with the President. He'll be addressing a joint meeting of Congress. And it was notable that he was invited by the congressional leadership last fall, actually, by the previous congressional leadership to come, but that Prime Minister Netanyahu was not. That was noted very much in Jerusalem, as a matter of fact, by the Prime Minister, according to my reporting. So there was a conversation with the President yesterday, and it was not a formal invitation, but a suggestion that there would be a meeting sometime in the fall, somewhere in the US. It was not even suggested that it would be a White House meeting. The US has always defended Israel at the United Nations. Is that becoming increasingly difficult, given this current coalition government's policies on settlements, which has made it increasingly difficult to even imagine geographically a Palestinian state?
Look, our position hasn't changed, that we stand with Israel. We defend Israel's right to defend itself. But we also call on both sides not to take any measures that would interfere with the possibility of achieving a two-state solution. And that message we give regularly to both sides. I traveled to the region. I met with Palestinians. I met with Israelis, President Herzog and the former government. And we have delivered those messages consistently over many, many years. And we will continue to do everything possible to get us to a place where we can reach the possibilities for both Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and prosperity. But again, it requires both sides to cooperate and not take actions that might lead us in the direction of not achieving that.
There really haven't been negotiations, credible negotiations, since 2014 by my count. Is there a leadership vacuum on both sides?
The leadership is there. The leadership, I think what we need to see is a commitment by both sides, the leadership on both sides, to find a peaceful way forward.
I wanted to ask you about confirmation process in the Senate, military and diplomatic. You've got one senator holding up approximately 300 military confirmations, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Marine Commandant, and you have another senator holding up more than 60 Senate confirmations of State Department positions, including 35 career ambassadors. Isn't this a national security problem?
It is a national security problem. We need our top leadership in the field. We need both our military as well as our diplomatic tools at their sharpest and at the highest levels. And many governments look at the fact that we don't have ambassadors there as a reflection of the lack of interest in their countries. We have to have our ambassadors in place. One of those 60 ambassadors, one of the 35, is Ambassador Shea, who is our ambassador in Lebanon, who's coming to be my deputy permanent representative. And she's had her hearing, and we're just waiting for her to be confirmed. We can't continue to do diplomacy with our hands tied behind our backs. And so there has to be more pressure on members of Congress to find a path to release these ambassadors as well as our military officers from the purgatory that these two senators have placed them in.
And finally, there's the issue, of course, of reproductive health for people in the military service. And Senator Tuberville, who spoke again, I believe, with Secretary Austin today. What is it that they don't seem to understand? You know, you were a woman of childbearing age, having children while you were a young Foreign Service officer, and know what the difficulties were decades ago when you were involved in government service and serving overseas. What don't they understand about women's needs for reproductive health services? Because this is not just abortion.
It is
care
about
for pregnant
reproductive
women.
health, and we've seen a number of really horrific cases where women have needed reproductive support that would require them to have an abortion or the removal of cells, and they can't get that, and it's a life or death situation for them. And the administration, again, has been very, very clear that this is an assault on women's rights to reproductive health.
Well, I know we've imposed on your time and on the altitude and all of the changes, but I just know that there's no better way to wrap up our opening session of the Aspen Security Forum than with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And now you know why so many members of the Foreign Service look up to Linda Thomas Greenfield. Thank you so much for the tour de force. For all participants, speakers, journalists, sponsors, we all deserve a toast. And so we're going to walk out the building, turn right, and walk to the other end of campus to Door Hosier, where we will host a welcoming cocktail party. We'll see you all there. Thanks.